Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. Blake, thanks for being on the show.
Totally. Thanks for having me.
You're the host, the creator of Abandon the All-American Ruins podcast. How did you get into it?
Well, you mentioned earlier when we were off mic that this particular podcast started in the pandemic. And when I first started describing this show to people as it started, I initially said that. But in reality, Abandoned and the All-American Ruins Project has a lengthy history dating back to 1993, when my father took my brother and I to this abandoned dairy farm that was down the hill from my house in Colorado, where I grew up. And I noticed we were walking around the perimeter, and I noticed that there was this gap of space between the ground and one of the doors underhangs. And I was like, well, I'm a tiny person. I know I can get in there. And so I went back the next day, unbeknownst to my parents, and shimmied underneath. And I entered this world that was so unbelievable to me and immediately was obsessed. And so the pandemic happened. There's a lot of stuff in between, obviously, like the rest of us. But the pandemic happened, and I woke up, I think 3 months into it, and I'd had this dream about that dairy farm. And I was, in addition to abandoned spaces as a kid, obsessed with audio dramas. My mother introduced me to vintage radio when I was very young, and I just got obsessed with this idea of sound as a storyteller. And so this dream about this dairy farm combined with this lifelong love of audio kind of just lended itself to this podcast. And what I love about this particular body of work is, so as an artist, and I know you can attest to this, it's never a great thing if you're trying to force your way into the project. The project has to invite you in. And I think the really beautiful thing about this entire body of work, not just the podcast, but the All-American Ruins multiverse in general, is that from the beginning, it's just been an invitation. And I keep kind of catching the rails and going on. And so by September of 2020, I realized that all of these blogs that I had written really lended themselves to sound. And I had started to realize there was this trend in podcasting that, while really invigorating in a lot of ways, wasn't really appealing to me anymore. And so I started wondering, well, is there a way to take my deep love of vintage drama and apply it to journalistic documentary style short form audio storytelling? And that is where Abandoned happened. And it took a long time to really understand what was happening. And I think if folks listen to the show, if you start with episode 1 and then you jump to the last episode in season 3, which is where I left off, it is a completely different game. And you know this yourself, having done 97 episodes, you learn so much along the way. But to answer your original question, it really started when I was a kid. And 35 years later, this weird little audio universe was born. And I haven't stopped since.
Dairy farm, what was it? There was a house, there was a barn? Like, what were the different buildings, outbuildings? What was it like exploring it?
For context, the dairy farm was built as part of a larger entity, which was the Modern Woodmen of America Tuberculosis Sanatorium.
Wow.
In the early 1900s, when tuberculosis was a massive issue, all of these different, what they called benefit societies, started building these sanatoriums specifically in states where sunshine was a big deal and the air was really dry, because the science at the time, it lent itself to this idea that a person's tarnished lungs could be healed in that kind of environment. And Colorado, being the state that gets the most sunshine out of any state in the union, over 300 days a year, plus its altitude, that science suggested that indeed we could heal patients with tuberculosis. So Modern Woodmen of America, which is now just a regular insurance company, so this mini town essentially was built by this organization, Modern Woodmen of America, which was called a fraternal benefit society. And essentially members would join and they got all of these insurance-like benefits, but for free. It was intentionally for lower income folks. And so they had this rush of patients come to this sanatorium, and every single patient got their own little hut. I was actually just back at the sanatorium property and got to poke inside one of the huts. And in addition to the climate, the science at the time suggested that a protein-packed diet would help the patient recover quicker. And so they built an entire dairy farm operation, which included a farmhouse and then just a giant barn and accompanying out barns. They hired a full staff. The main farmer lived there with his family. And this milk that was being harvested from these cows was specifically intended for these patients to heal from tuberculosis. And so I drew this connection far down into the rabbit hole of All American Ruins, but it wasn't lost on me that the origin space of this particular body of work was born out of an organization that was built to help heal people's lungs, and that the connective tissue was in 2020, the project really came into its own at a time when people, again, were struggling to breathe because COVID was impacting people's lungs. And so it was really interesting to be like, wow, this whole project is centered around the idea that people can't breathe. And we're living at a really, really particularly desperate moment where I think a lot of people are struggling just to feel grounded and feel safe. And I think the biggest component of the project that I love, there's a whole community of people who explore abandoned buildings.
It's called Urban
Exploration.
Okay.
Yeah. And tons of beautiful photographers, tons of beautiful videographers. But I knew going into it, that's not what I do. I'm a storyteller at heart. That is my bread and butter. And if I'm going to lend my voice to this community in a way that feels impactful, I'm going to have to approach it from a storytelling perspective. From the beginning, I've had a hugely overactive imagination. And when I first entered that dairy farm at the age of 6, my imagination immediately kicked in. And it led me years and years and years later, when I started building this body of work, to realize that there is an actual word for the sensation that people often feel, which is nostalgia for a time and place that one has never known. And the word is anemoia.
Anemoia.
And an ex of mine introduced me to the word, and he was like, this is exactly what your project is. And I was like, oh shit, this is exactly what this project is. And so more than being a body of work that explores abandoned buildings, it is actually a diary and a love letter to the human imagination being a space for healing and for sanctuary. And I think at this current juncture, the more that humans can really sink their teeth into their imaginations, the better off we're going to be, because things are they're getting weird. And I think people are going to have to start being very creative about how they exist and in a way that keeps their sanity in check. And All American Ruins offers folks an opportunity to take a break from the grim reality that we're all living in right now and take a little trip with me inside these abandoned spaces, not just historically, but also observing culture and then really just kind of letting the fantasy take hold. And so every episode really toes this line between documentary storytelling and fantastical storytelling, because I'm letting folks know from the get-go exactly what's going through my imagination as I'm wandering through these spaces. And I think a lot of people, just in general, when you go out into New York City, for example, I would imagine that if you sit yourself on any stoop or park bench and you people watch, you are creating little stories about the people
definitely.
that are walking
Yeah.
by. It's the same exact
Yeah.
thing, but with ghosts.
Yeah. You ever wish you were born at a different time period in history?
Every day of my life.
What is there one specific period?
It certainly varies. I've always really dug the 70s. I think the late 60s and the early 70s, just with the color and the notion that social consciousness was really waking up, and these cultural shifts that were happening in community. I really dig it. I also just think the color is really cool at the time.
It was. Hairstyles, clothing styles.
Yeah, and art was so, there was such a sense of freedom to artistic practice, and people were really kind of dispelling this post World War II perfect mindset of what the American family looks like, and they were really starting to just let their freak flags fly.
Yeah.
And, as a queer person in America, I think the late 60s and early 70s is also such a cornerstone for my own history, because that was also when the gay rights movement was really starting to take hold. But, like at night to fall asleep sometimes, I listen to this YouTube channel called Nemo's Dreamscapes. And this guy, he has taken all of these old records from the 30s and the 40s, and he has really just like amplified the reverb and the sound. And so there's this very like ghostly, distant past that feels very present, and it helps me fall asleep. So, I mean, the 1930s would be cool because you'd get an opportunity to see what real economic devastation looks like in this country.
I would choose the 70s, I think, over there.
For sure. But then you're hitting like the gas crisis of 1979,
yeah.
and you're hitting the Vietnam War era. And it's, it's kind of all to say that, like, regardless of what time period we've found ourselves in, there's always going to be crisis.
Yeah.
But I think the 60s and the 70s was just like such a moment of change, and to be present for that change, I think, would be very, very cool.
I mean, and it must say something that's kind of the beginning of the post-industrialization of the United States. And that's 100%. When I'd imagine a lot of these places that you're visiting, that period, 60s through maybe even the early 1990s, where things started to become abandoned as we moved from a industrial factory economy to, I don't know, a service experience economy. I don't even know what we call ourselves. I mean, I got interested in it because I went to SUNY Binghamton, and that was basically the headquarters of shoe manufacturing in the United States for World War II, EJ Shoes, Endicott Johnson Shoes. And by the time I was there, that was all decimated and had moved to Mexico and overseas. And there were all these abandoned buildings. And it was right from that period, from the late 60s, early 1970s, that was their heyday. And that's in the 1970s is when that decline started to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about just my own familial history. My grandfather, he worked for General Motors, and the General Motors factory in Lockport, New York, which is where he worked, of course, abandoned. And thinking about this idea that the American worker has always been treated as subservient and has always been a tool used by the upper classes to keep their wealth expedited. And I think about my grandfather sometimes, this particular grandfather, my dad's dad, when I wander through these spaces, and just thinking about his entire identity was focalized around what work he did. And it was always the identity in question. What do you do?
Mm-hmm.
I work at a General Motors factory.
Yeah.
I work with explosives in this factory. He had his eye blasted out while he was working at this. I mean, it's just, it's fascinating to look at these spaces. And I think that is part of that anemoia sensation that I feel. There's an empathy behind it, or even actually maybe more so compassion behind it, because people's stories are really embedded into the walls of these abandoned spaces, and we're talking like hundreds of thousands of people who have passed through
Yeah.
the walls of these places that are now just completely forgotten. And it's very intriguing to me, and it almost feels like a way to kind of like offer an apology to these folks by saying, look, I'm never going to meet all of you. I'm never going to be able to like stand for your stories. But at the very least, I want people to remember that when they're walking by an abandoned building, it is soaked in story. And I think those stories are important. And so, yeah, I mean, to your point too, like, God, Binghamton, that is all from Albany to Buffalo. It's just like it is Rust Belt right.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly at that point, it was the post-industrial dystopia. And I mean, I'd imagine, is there a geographic location in the United States that is got more abandoned buildings and I don't know, better abandoned buildings than others? I'd imagine the Rust Belt would be one of the first places to come to mind.
For sure. I mean, the Rust Belt, it's interesting, with industrial abandoned spaces specifically, yes, the Rust Belt from Albany, to like Indianapolis, it is a very potent industrial urbex dreamscape. When you start venturing out further into the plains and towards the mountain territories, you start to lose those kinds of abandoned spaces, and you start to see more farmland kinds of abandoned spaces. So again, houses on abandoned dairy properties.
Yeah.
And then as far as just like entertainment and human interest is concerned, giant abandoned horse race track, giant abandoned roadside motels, and places that, as far as American industry is concerned, also have been left behind because of things like superhighways. And so, yeah, it kind of depends on where you are and what vibe you're looking for, I guess. But every state in this union has thousands of abandoned spaces. I think the last number that I read was there are roughly 25,000 documented abandoned industrial spaces alone.
Wow.
This is notwithstanding homes, entertainment venues. It's so there's so much ruin in this country, and you can really trace it on a map. You can trace the story of where industry has gone in this country via its abandonments.
Right. And I mean, the Great Plains, I was in North Dakota this past summer, Nebraska, North Dakota. So I did some episodes out there, and I had been for months following, I think it's called Abandoned Dakotas, and just really cool pictures of abandoned, mostly, schools, but more home life, farm life. And as the commercialization, the industrialization of farming has taken over these small family farms, people, pulled up stakes and left. And for that area of the country, it's all about the family farms, and very, very spooky in a way. And that, so you have, thousands of people working in a factory and then nobody. And do you ever wonder, like, did they have a going away party? Did it just kind of happen that people got laid off in waves until there were 3 people left, and then they hired some outside firm to, I don't know, scrap what was left? Are there calendars left over from 1983? Like, does it just feel like nuclear war happened and just time stopped in a split second?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends on the place. There is no mercy for the American worker. There never has been. And I've read countless stories about different factories that I've visited where it was an overnight sensation. This was not a gentle removal of the worker. This was, we don't need you anymore. We found cheaper labor. You are expendable. Goodbye. And I mean, I think the best example I can give you is from season 1. There is a factory that's located in Huguenot, New York, which is down U.S. State Route 209, which is what I call America's abandoned highway, because you cannot go a quarter mile without coming across an abandoned space.
Where is this in New York?
Huguenot, New York. So it's about, I'd say, 20 minutes north of Port Jervis, which is right on the tri-junction of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. And so that area, in addition to being a huge industrial geographical stratosphere for a long time until, as you mentioned, a lot of jobs were picked up and moved to Mexico, it was also part of a resort revolution lifestyle because of the Borscht Belt, which is the area of the Catskills where hundreds and hundreds of resorts that were built by Jewish Americans in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s existed and then all fell into ruin.
Yeah.
And so there's this double whammy of industry removal that affected every single one of these communities down Route 209. And this factory in Huguenot, it was C&D Battery Technologies. And they had gone through a number of different transformations. I think it started as like a TV tube company in the 40s. But the article that I found on Mid-Hudson News from 2006 suggested that every single employee walked into the building that day. They were all brought into a giant room. Every single one of them let go at the same time. So overnight, literally, a town whose entire economic reliance was on this one factory was gone. And so you can see 20 years later, the after effects of that still pounding down that particular town, really any town that's on Route 209. We're talking not just economic devastation, but we're also talking about the devastation of the American spirit. And this leads to all kinds of mental wellness issues. It leads to addiction rates skyrocketing, and it just leads to general community morale being so low that people feel like they really don't have any purpose in life.
Yeah.
And I for one really, really detest that. And it's why when I go to these spaces, first of all, I never take anything. And I always leave them as they are. But when I start to talk about them on mic and when I start to formulate these stories, I am determined to constantly remind folks again, these are real people. These are people like you and me who had a job, who had families, who had lifestyles. And so often that was just torn out from underneath them. And many people never recovered. I was just talking to a guy yesterday. I went to the Ulster County Chamber of Commerce January breakfast. And really long story short, the CFO of Archtop Fiber, which is an internet company, came up to me because I had said something during the breakfast to our state senator about internet in this area and the monopoly that Spectrum has. And he, apologized and said, we're working really hard to get, internet out there. But our conversation as it wound down, I found out that he worked for the company that my father worked for, that during the Enron scandal was kind of overshadowed by Enron because they had a very similar scandal happen. And just like C&D Battery Technologies, overnight, thousands of employees across the country, because one selfish D-bag decided he was going to think only about himself and only about his resources, and thousands of people were impacted. And this guy who I was talking to, he was like, yeah, and in 2007, right before the housing crisis, my stock plummeted from over $2 million to $0, which is exactly what happened to my dad. Wow. So this is a pattern, and it's not a new system that we're talking about. And so I think that is one of the things that I think about all the time when I'm wandering through these spaces, and not just the industrial spaces, but the neighborhoods around them that are also impacted by this commerce rejection and the complete upheaval of an industry that just wrecks communities.
Yeah, I mean, you don't see the home goods store and the cute coffee shop next to an abandoned building.
You sure don't. That's right. And in Kingston, New York, the IBM factory when that was abandoned in the late 90s into the 2000s, you can see the impact still happening on businesses over there, because I'd say 50% of the real estate in that area of Kingston, New York is still abandoned. They're making a lot of progress towards this revitalization effort, but that requires the work of a billionaire coming in and saying, I would like to give money to this town. That's not the case for a lot of places in this country.
Yeah. And Kingston is proximity to New York City, whereas
right.
a lot of places don't have, they don't have that.
They don't. It's, the Dakotas, my God, you forget it. If a community is decimated after a factory closes somewhere like that, it's over.
Yeah.
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 But I will also say, just on the flip side, where like more hope is concerned, I do think so many people have woken up to this idea that the American economy is not what it seems. And I think the more people that are getting hip to that idea, the better off we're going to be as far as change is concerned. And I, for one, refuse to let the the grim reality of where we're at impact my joy. And I think just being able to create art in general, well, you said it yourself when you were off mic, like it allows you the ability to communicate with other human beings and to socialize and just to like learn about other people whose lives are different than you. And so I try really hard to instill hope and joy into what I do.
It's a tough one,
but it's hard.
I mean, it is. There is that fascinating part of it. I mean, I think you did say that you're more interested in the buildings than the objects inside of them. But I mean, I think the objects can be very cool, and
Totally.
just the idea of imagining yourself in someplace different. In terms of just let's put some boots on the ground and talk the basics. Like, how do you find these places, and how do you get into them?
The Urbex community is very secretive.
I see.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that one is often bending the law.
Right.
I won't say fully breaking, but
bending, I like that, yes.
Often bending it. And so there's that part of it. But the other part of it is when a person has a hobby and that hobby involves precarious situations with precarious architecture that is on the brink of collapse, and there is this deep sensation of admiration and love for these spaces, the will to protect it increases substantially. And so when I first started diving into the community a little bit, I learned very quickly that people are not as willing to share locations with you.
Interesting.
Unless they know you. And that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's the way anything in life goes. You're not going to get the full farm from the person unless you really get to know them. And so it took a lot of research, and it took a lot of long nights on Reddit, diving down subreddits and taking little hints that people had given and plugging those hints into Google and using Google Glass to try and identify buildings and their locations. And I often fail, but more often than not, now that I've, kind of gained a little bit of a family in this group of people, I'm able to tap into certain resources. Like when I was in Colorado for the past 2 months, a friend of mine who lives in Denver, who weirdly I met through the Borscht Belt Historical Marker Project here in New York, he gave me a map that this woman had created on Google Maps with an overlay of all of these different pins, hundreds and hundreds of pins that she has spent years putting together. And so those kinds of relationships are really helpful, because certainly you're not going to just decide to start the hobby of urban exploration and expect that you're going to be able to start strong with locations.
You kind of have to have a few easy wins.
Yeah. And I think too, like, there are certain sort of juggernauts in the community, like the Nevele Grand Resort, which is in Ellenville, New York, 550-acre property nestled up to the Shawangunk Mountains, that are just very well known. And so it's not challenging to find them.
So now they're almost like theme parks for
weirdos.
Explore.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a business in
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing too. That's where it becomes really tricky is like there are people who have created, guided tour small businesses on the side, and it pisses a lot of people off because they're bringing a lot more population into the mix that offers more of the potential for these places to fall further into ruin and ultimately collapse. But I think the thing that I came to in all of this, and I'm not protective about locations. If somebody hits me up and asks me for a location, I'll do a little bit of like scanning their Instagram profile or whatever. But to me, I don't own these places.
Right.
I don't own the land that they sit on.
Yeah.
I'm here temporarily and then I'm going to be gone. And so to take some kind of authority or ownership over a space that you simply do not have any stake in, aside from your deep love of it, I think is wild. And so I have come to the personal conclusion, and I don't force narratives on anybody, but I am not going to be so precious about these spaces to think that I can make them somehow last forever, because that's just not reality. It's not pragmatic.
And, one of the things about this whole idea of the abandoned places is that what's best for maybe the explorer community is that these abandoned places are there and people can still visit them. But what may be best for the community of people living there is something completely different, is that they're torn down.
Yeah. Well, and this is where it gets really interesting and tricky. And I talk about this a lot on the show because there is this wanderlusty romantic in me that would love nothing more than for certain spaces to last forever, and for that decay and the beauty of that decay, the very strange beauty of that decay, to exist, in perpetuity. And oftentimes, I think, like the factory I was talking about in Huguenot, that building, which people have to drive by every single day, exists as a symbol of deep pain. And while I, of course, really appreciate history and reminders from history about the things that we have learned as a society, and hopefully will not make the same mistakes again, I think there are historical markers that are very important for that reason. I think there are other places like CND battery technologies that, yes, actually, perhaps selfishly, my desire to be able to keep visiting it does not supersede the community that has to live next to it and feels a deep, deep well of pain and resentment because the building still exists and yet it is unoccupied, and that's painful. I was down in Florida a couple years ago, and I had gotten a location from a friend of the Broward Women's Prison. And I checked Google Maps, and this is often the case. Sometimes the spaces just straight up aren't there when you go.
Wow.
I checked Google Maps. The latest Google Earth Street View suggested that the property was still there. And I showed up. I drove like an hour outside of Miami, and I showed up, and this building was gone, and there was an Amazon warehouse.
Of course, yes, yeah.
Of course. And my initial gut instinct was, what the fuck? Why? This is so annoying. But then I started thinking about, oh, this is a prison. I can't imagine that the community surrounding this prison really has fond memories
Right.
of the building that housed, serial killer Eileen Warnos.
Right.
Is going to really be bummed out that this place has been demolished.
Yeah.
And so, I was disappointed for a second, and then came to my senses, and I was like, dude, this doesn't concern you. This is not your community, first of all. Second of all, this is a very painful symbol of, the American prison system. Probably best that they got rid of it. Not sure an Amazon warehouse is what I would have done with the property, but,
Right.
Here we are.
I mean, in terms of like fascinating places to visit, I got to imagine the prison is up there.
It's still on my list. I was so jazzed. I was like, yes, this is another kind of space that I'm checking off the bucket list. But I'm very much interested. There is actually, you probably drove right by it. On 84, just outside of Beacon in Fishkill, there is a prison that was recently emptied. And I don't know the status. I think there are still staff people there kind of
Across from the baseball field?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. I
That
didn't
was
realize
empty.
that. Wow.
Yeah, they transferred all of those inmates to different prisons in the state. And so it is no longer occupied by anybody.
Really?
And so that's one I've just kind of like, I've got friends in Beacon, and when I go down, I'll drive by and see, but the lights are still on, and like, I'm not about to mess with law enforcement in any capacity. But yeah, I would love to visit a prison, which also is actually, when I think about it, it's like kind of subverted and
it is
like even grosser than normal because it's like, again, like this is a symbol of imprisonment.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I still think it would be cool.
You think it would be easier to get in than to escape a prison?
That's exactly right. And then it's like, well, we have Alcatraz, and it is possible to go to Alcatraz.
Yeah, I mean, huge tourist attraction.
Yeah, which is abandoned, and maybe I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Maybe my scruples will come to their senses, and I'll just go to Alcatraz one day.
Yeah. I mean, it's technically abandoned, but in ways it's not.
Yeah, it's like repurposed.
Yeah, repurposed, I think would be the better
But they're
term.
certainly not occupying the space anymore.
Yeah, I wonder what they'll do with that. I mean, that's a megalithic prison. I mean, that's like a castle of a prison off of 84 there. So I'm just wondering, do they repurpose it and make it, I don't know, some sort of technical college, or what do they do with it? I mean, maybe it could be a cool theme park. I don't know. I feel like today people would have an appetite for something repurpose in a cool kind of way and make a prison into, I don't know, an Airbnb or something.
Yeah, I mean, I do like the idea of a prison property being revitalized for a public park, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is the thing about demolition and revitalization. It is exorbitantly expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars to revitalize those kinds of properties, especially something that was built with such a specific intention.
Yeah.
And the architecture alone, if you look at a blueprint of a prison, how do you remove all of those steel? I mean,
right. There's just concrete. It's just
it's layers and layers of questions.
These aren't prefab metal sheds.
No, it's right, exactly. It's not like cheap siding that you see often when you're driving by any house in New York State. Yeah. It's brick and stone and steel.
And so maybe that's why they are still there, a lot of these abandoned buildings. It's just easier to build something from scratch and not have to do the demolition piece. I don't know. What do you do? Implode these buildings? I'd imagine unless you're in a true urban area where the real estate is so expensive that it does make sense. But I'd imagine in most places it doesn't.
There is no question that demolition is cheaper than revitalization, because you have to think about, first of all, the land itself. Have we poisoned it? The C&D battery technology factory being a super fun
right.
site.
Nobody wants to touch it.
Why would you plop property where you could possibly make a bunch of people sick?
Here's a former cornfield. Much easier. Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Second of all, the actual building itself, is it toxic? What's the mold situation? What is the situation with asbestos? My dad, who has been living with stage 4 mesothelioma for like a decade now, he is not thrilled about this hobby that I have taken up.
Right.
Because the asbestos exposure that I have certainly put myself in the way of is probably very grandiose.
Yeah.
So you have to think about that. And then you have to think about the state of the material. Mm-hmm. But in the first episode of the podcast, my mom points out it is just a tremendous waste of resource. But that's American capitalism for you. Yeah. We're not worried about the resource expending it takes to make something happen. We're just worried about the profit.
Yeah.
And if the profit is going to outweigh the revitalization, profit will always go first.
Have you ever encountered dangerous situations where you got chunks of concrete falling, or tweakers, or just crazy characters?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very careful around other humans I don't know, just in real life. When it comes to abandoned spaces, if I even get the hint of somebody a mile away, I'm out of there before I can say my own name. I've met some lovely people in abandoned spaces, but I'm always extremely cautious because you are often without cell service. You are in a location that most people don't know.
Right.
And so I have taken up the hobby of letting my partner know exactly where I am on the Google map.
Yeah.
And I will check in, periodically just to make sure that he's cool. But in terms of structural, there is a school in Painter, Virginia, which is on Virginia's eastern shore, which is another stretch of just like totally forgotten Americana. And the school in Painter, Virginia, Central High School, I went up to the second floor, and it's funny, my uncle, who is also an architect and also not thrilled about this hobby, told me in the very beginning, he gave me certain tips and tricks that I could use to lessen the chances of getting hurt should something happen with the building. And I didn't listen. And I went to the second floor and I walked into this classroom. And there was a giant hole in the wall that looked over this beautiful cornfield. It was such a gorgeous, and then perpendicular to that was the chalkboard, and it was just such a great image. And I was in my little, whimsical romantic mindset, and I walked directly dead center in the room and succeeded to fall right through the floor. I took a step and plummeted.
Wow.
And the only reason that I didn't wind up going all the way down is because I somehow caught myself. I was between two beams of the floor, and I caught myself on both.
Oh my goodness.
It was total happenstance. I lost both of those shoes to the grit and grime of the soaked floor underneath. That was bad. That was really bad. And it was in that moment where I was like, okay, I really need to establish some serious ground rules that I'm adhering to, because otherwise this is going to become a problem. And so I don't ever go anywhere without a mask anymore because asbestos and other stuff. It is exceedingly likely that I will have a buddy with me if I go, because there was this one time, the late Julie Novak, who was my best friend, she died of breast cancer at the end of August in 2024, and she was my adventure buddy. And she was also the most boisterous, open, could talk to a fly and have a good conversation kind of person, and was always talking to strangers. And we were at the Green Mountain Racetrack in Pownal, Vermont, and I was up in the rafters of the sort of the main stadium, and I looked out and I could see two people walking towards the stadium, and I tried to signal Julie. I was like, "Yo!" She was already walking out towards them, waving, so excited to see other people. And it wound up being great because I wound up interviewing this woman, Dina Smith, who has some very fascinating beliefs in, I think I saw it on your page, the Tartarian Empire.
Yes.
And I do have an episode coming out this season where you said something about, getting shitty audio. I was recording the interview on my phone at Julie's insistence, and none of the audio was usable. But because of how I have structured this podcast, I'm allowed to lean into the fantasy, and my audience actually expects it. And so I took all of the text. I hired my friend Terry, who's an actress, to come recreate Dina.
Okay.
And so we'll have the episode will be this season. So,
there you go.
And I note to the audience, by the way, this is an actress playing Dina because I'm an idiot and I didn't get good audio.
So what is the Tartarian Empire? I'd never heard of it before.
Well, I think there's reason for that. It is a sort of mythological, some people don't think it's mythological, ancient empire that has sort of there are whispers and what's it called? You can find traces of it all over the world. And there's this belief in this, ancient empire that you can find pyramids underground in the mountains of Vermont. I mean, it's it's a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And Dina and her husband, I think his name is Mike, were going across the country with the goal to find the Tartarian Empire and its remnants in the United States. And she firmly believes it. She is absolutely 100% believes that this is a thing that exists. And I love that for her. I really think it's awesome. There's no accurate historical evidence to suggest that this is a thing, but there is alternative information out there where a piece of rock was found and it led someone to think this, that, and the other thing. And sooner than later, a community was built very much like flat earthers.
Yeah. Seems more harmless than the flat earthers and, sense of purpose, right?
That's exactly right. And that's the thing about conspiracy theories too. Unless they're dangerous, let go, do your thing.
They're entertainment.
Absolutely. Yeah. We all have our things. Yeah. And I think it's cool.
I don't know if you're going to find that empire at the abandoned Green Mountain racetrack.
But they really thought that there was a pyramid underneath that racetrack.
Wow.
They fervently believe it.
Wow.
And then we got into talking about Christianity, and I sort of dissociated. But it nonetheless, it would not have been my decision to talk to those people. And yet I got a really, really awesome conversation and got to talk to two really cool people who have very different beliefs than I do. And yet we were able to share a space together and break some, elusive bread. And what's wrong with that? It probably would behoove all of us a little bit to be talking to strangers, especially the ones that maybe don't share the same values or beliefs with you, because we are certainly not going to succeed as a democracy if that's not possible.
Yeah, and that's part of the imagination piece too.
It absolutely is. I mean, I know the 35 minutes of Dina's life that she let on. I don't know anything else about her. I got 35 minutes of tape, unusable tape, and had to thusly create my own story about her. It's not accurate by any sense of the imagination, but that imagination piece also allows me to bridge the gap between the phrase conspiracy theorist and human. Mm-hmm. She's still a human being with her own traumas and joys that have created the person who fervently believes that the Tartarian Empire exists. I don't see any problem with that, and I'm certainly not going to rain on her parade.
Yeah. You talked about Julie, and Nick also features prominently, and maybe we can talk about people that are past and ghosts that you've seen, either real or imagined.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I've been working on this audio theater piece, which is an adaptation of the podcast that is going to be presented next year. Again, the second workshop at SUNY New Paltz. It's called Fading Transmissions from a Republic of Ruins. And when I was driving out to do this residency at this organization called Green Box Arts to start building this particular audio theater piece, live audio theater piece, I should say, I explored a lot of different spaces. And having been at this for 5 years and change, I have been obviously wondering, the Anamoya piece of this is clearly a draw. But what else is it about these places that keeps me coming back? And I realized that All American Ruins, despite the fact that, in the title, I'm talking about abandoned buildings, it's actually a project that is a reverie and a reverie investigation of ghosts and what the word ghost actually means. I've been obsessed with ghosts and aliens probably before I was with abandoned buildings.
Yeah.
And as I started exploring these spaces, I began to wonder, is it actually scientific to say that according to the laws of physics, the electrons that we expend as human beings are exchanged with objects that are in our spaces? And if those electrons never die, if matter doesn't die, then is it safe to say that in fact, scientifically, we can say ghosts are possible. It's not the like spooky white sheet that comes to haunt you that maybe that, other people might say. But what is an abandoned space? It's a ghost. This is a living, breathing, inanimate ghost. And so I started thinking a lot about this connection between abandoned spaces and ghosts. And, as it happened, losing Julie over the course of this process, and she was a huge supporter of this body of work. She was like so into it, and so like when I would hit walls and I was like, I'm ready to give up. This sucks. No one's listening. Who cares? She was always the person that was like, dude, what are you talking about? And when I lost her, I started wondering, like, is she going to still be going with me to these places? Because we had visited spaces together where ghosts of other people who I know and love, who have since passed, definitely came to mind. I can't rightfully say that I 100% believe in ghosts. I think the loss of another human being in one's life is a hugely traumatic experience that is probably one we can never fully recover from. And I think we have invented things like ghosts to help us deal with that grief and help us
possibly,
live through this just deeply terrible trauma of losing another person. Nick, in particular, the first person I ever fell in love with, he passed from suicide in 2017, right like the week I had moved up here to the Hudson Valley from the city. And he was a very, very important person in my life. Even after we broke up, he remained a person. He was the first person I can really say that saw me for 100% me. Like, I had just come out of the closet when I got to college, and he was the first person who said, I love you, and meant the whole of you, not just the parts of you that I know about and or appreciate. It was everything. And so he was really important to me in that regard. And he was also just like such a fan. He was just like my number one fan, and everything I did, he was always on the sidelines, cheering me on. And our relationship didn't work out. But after he passed, I had a couple experiences where I was like, my 50% belief in like the spooky ghosts that we think about is now like 90%.
Wow.
And you can listen to season 3, episode 4, but I can summarize it for you. When Julie and I went to the abandoned Irish Center of Pittsburgh, he was on my mind the whole time. And his Irish heritage was like a really big part of who he was. And he really, really loved that part about himself. And so he was on my mind the whole time. And there was a moment where I was in the theater space at this community center that was abandoned. And I came across this Heads Up penny. And that had been our thing. And, Heads Up pennies appear, they're everywhere. But it was such a nice, like, little wink from him to be like, you have to keep doing this.
Wow.
And what's like double sad, but also just kind of like sweet, is now that episode existing, you can hear Julie's voice in it. And so there's like, my two buddies, like, kind of hanging out in the beyond. And it's nice too. It's like kind of what I was saying about inventing ghosts to help us get through these really difficult losses. Having documentation of a person as well is so helpful to, through the grieving process. And so it's so funny, like that episode was the episode that was submitted for the Ambies, which is like the Oscars of podcasting. And I just got the news on Wednesday that the show was nominated.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But I was so glad that that was the episode that was submitted, because it doesn't just contain, my eulogy for Nick. It's it's a version of a eulogy for Nick, but now Julie's in there too, and I love that. Anyway, this is all to say that, yeah, I mean, it is damn near impossible to walk into an abandoned space and not instantly be thinking about like the ghosts that are lingering there. And like, I think a ghost is just a story. Like, the word story and the word ghost are kind of synonymous when it comes to like passing on our history and remembering who we are personally and collectively and where we've come from and where we're going. And so it's nice. And now I get to make the joke that, there's a little vial of Julie's ashes on my piano that sometimes I'll take with me to explore, just to be like, well, there's a small part of her that's still physically here. And I've like joked with friends where I'm like, because Julie was obsessed with the objects in these places, and that was one of the many, many, many glass bottles that she found. She and I had varying scruples about taking things. So that's one of the bottles that she found. And I love when friends come over and I'm like, yeah, that's one of the bottles that Julie found. And they'll pick it up and I'll be like, and she's inside it too. And she would have loved that. But yeah, I mean, God, I just think we have ghosts constantly surrounding us all the time. I mean, think about all the people that you've lost in your life. It's inevitable that we are going to feel haunted moving forward. But it's also like, again, to lean into a little bit of hope. It's all the more reason to keep living your life boldly and bravely and without fear, because it is your responsibility as a person who is continuing to live after people you've loved have passed away. They would expect it of you.
Yeah.
I hope.
My last podcast I did was with a mortician.
Oh, no shit.
Yes. And his belief, and I asked him about this, and his belief is that the body is just a container for the soul, and consciousness is contained within the body, and consciousness never dies. It's just the body moves on and is cremated or embalmed. And I agree with that.
And isn't it amazing too? Like, we don't know for sure.
We don't.
None of us know for sure. And so having a belief like that is so, so special, because it does substantiate continuing to live in a world that's very, very challenging to live in sometimes. It really authenticates our reason for staying alive. And I think that's so, so awesome.
There's this group, a large contingent of folks who have had these near-death experience, the NDEs as they're called, and they meet regularly at conferences, and it has gotten more scientific rigor and esteem around it, and many of their stories are very, very, very similar and life-changing for a lot of these folks. And so to me, that's a portal, that's a signal that there's more there.
Yeah, I mean, my experience with the one true ghostly experience that I had with Nick, there were just too many coincidences lined up that I possibly could have fathomed. And it's a long story, and you can hear it in the podcast episode. But I still don't want to name what it was, because I don't know, which is also going to be the title of my memoir. But boy, was that close. I mean, you can't have lined up all of those coincidences that happened within a 10-minute time span and not really rethink your belief in the afterlife. It was just too much. And so I do kind of still carry this skepticism about it, but it is a joyful skepticism that allows me, in the moments where I really, really miss him and really wish I could talk to him, to be like, hey, actually, you can talk to him. He's certainly not going to respond in the way that would be super helpful right now, but he's listening to you.
Yeah.
Because he's in my consciousness. Everything that I learned from him is now part of my DNA. And so I can lean into the things that I learned from him, and that can be the symbol of a ghost can be really reaching back into the memory bank and being like, what was that thing that he said that one time that would be so great right now? And it always helps. Always.
It feels like going to an abandoned place would make you closer to the past.
Oh my God. Well, you talked about what decade would you like to go to? Go to an abandoned building, and you can. You can absolutely time travel.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, God, it would be so cool if you could time travel. And I think that quantum physics is, as you said, the scientific community is inching closer and closer to maybe some, more well-informed answers about things like ghosts and time travel than we ever have before. When I saw the movie Interstellar, first of all, I had to watch it again because I was like, what the fuck did I just watch? But when I watched it again and really started to digest what they were saying, I was like, oh, wow, maybe time travel is possible. But the closest you're going to get if you're a non-believer in ghosts and time travel to those things is definitely an abandoned space. I mean, it's a haunt. Like,
It is, yeah.
The human brain is so, isn't it amazing? It's the most amazing specimen on planet Earth. Like, we have the capacity to enter any given space, and the electrics that are firing in our brains and letting your imagination create the picture of the place, letting your imagination wonder what the place was, letting your imagination start to maybe even see ghosts wandering around. And then you have actual historical documentation, and you get to compare a photograph or a video of that space as it was when human life was active inside of it, and then getting to compare the two. Like, yeah, you just time traveled straight up. But like my friend Isabel says this all the time, the human body was meant to move through space on legs. When we go to the grocery store in our car, we are in effect time traveling because we were not meant to get to point B that quickly. And so, yeah, I mean, ghosts, time travel, I'm all for it. And when somebody has like concrete evidence, I'm so ready to buy it. But until then, I have like a 99% belief, and there's like a 1% skepticism. But I want to be curious for the rest of my life. I don't ever want to have an answer to anything. I think it's boring, and it doesn't leave room for that imagination component to take hold in our lives. And like, God, wouldn't it be so boring if we didn't have things to be curious about?
I mean, that's it. If you disagree or dispel everything, then what's left?
Point? Yeah.
There is no imagination. It's like everything is black and white. It's exactly as you see it. There is nothing to get excited about.
No, my friend Dylan Thuris, who co-founded Atlas Obscura, he said, I profiled him on my show, and he said this thing, and I think this is the direct quote. He said, "Imagination is the totality of human existence." And I loved that. I was like, that's it. That's exactly right. Everything we see, everything we think, it's all rooted in the human imagination.
I mean, even these buildings, some architect designed them.
That's right. You had teams. First of all, you had someone who had the idea, should I build
the business,
a thing so that, like, here's 550 acres nestled up to the Shawangunk Mountains. Should I build a safe haven for Jewish people to come and have some peace and quiet in a world where they're not welcome? That sounds like a good idea. And then think of the hundreds and hundreds of people that it took to actualize that. It's so cool. Like the pathway, the transference. Like, if I wish there was a way to like visualize, like to make a visual of the transference from imagined idea to actualized reality, because it's just cool.
And I'd imagine in some respects that the creative folks are more likely to not to say believe, but entertain ideas of ghosts or theories, conspiracy or otherwise. Do you feel that way?
100%. I mean, it was really hard to understand why I always felt like such a weirdo as a kid. And people would always say, well, he's the creative one. He's the artsy one. But if you sit my baby sister and my big brother next to me and you ask us a question about something like a ghost, for example, you're going to get 3 very different answers. And more often than my brother is a writer, so he's actually a deeply artistic person, and he's a journalist and a painter. But my answer to something is definitely going to be far more romantic and dreamscapey than my baby sister, let's say. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I do find that I am more inclined to want to share space and break bread with people who also have brains that kind of supersede everything that we see and what we're told is true. And that's just creativity.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
So speaking of creativity, what's season 4 shaping up like?
Well, as you know, and I would like to put this on mic so that folks listening understand, this is a gospel I'm going to preach for the rest of my life. Podcasting is very hard. It is very hard. And when you're doing it in a silo and you don't have a production company, a team behind you, you don't have access to resource to make the thing happen the way that you would like, it takes a lot of time and it's very challenging. And I'm very proud of this body of work because I did create a substantial portion of it by myself.
Yeah.
I'm very proud of that. I've learned a lot. But towards the end of season 3, I kind of sat back and was like, oh, I have a theater background. Like my education is in theater, and I miss collaborative art making. It's been so awesome for so many reasons that this project has been basically generated by me. And like, that's not even really true. But every story was from my imagination. Every episode of this podcast, I have designed the sound, and I have edited, and I have mixed, and I have mastered. I have written the first pass of the script. I have done every single shred of hosting, save one episode. And I'm bored. I realized I miss not being in this artistic silo that we find ourselves in at 3:00 in the morning, like stitching together, editing on GarageBand or whatever. And so season 4 is going to be really fun because I have invited 3 guest producers who are going to be taking the host and producer reins on. It's 3 stories, but one of the stories is going to be divided into 2 episodes by my friend Isabel, who hosted. She's the only guest host I've ever had, and produced and wrote an episode in season 3 called Frozen in Time. But she and my friend Dylan, who I mentioned, and my friend Stev, who is a storyteller and a writer and just like a sheer genius, they are all going to be guest writing, producing, and hosting episodes this coming season.
Nice.
So out of the 12 episodes, we will have 4 that are hosted by other people. And then the remaining 8, Terry's voice is a huge part of one of them. So I'm not the subject. Dina, as portrayed by Terry, is at the racetrack in Vermont. I went on this awesome first and only date to an abandoned missile test site up in Ballston Spa, New York.
Nice.
With this friend of mine named Ricky. And he is the subject of that episode. And it's going to be talking about, again, the human imagination creating stories in our heads when we go on things like first dates and like imagining, wow, I'm really vibing with this person. What could our relationship look like?
Oh,
20
yes.
years from
Projecting.
now? Exactly.
Yeah.
So he's the subject of that. And then this live audio theater piece that I've been creating, which is immersive in design. It's called Fading Transmissions from a Republic of Ruins. And eventually it will be a whole 75-minute theater piece. But for the sake of the podcast, the first episode I was able to do live at this organization in Colorado, Greenbox Arts. So the kickoff episode to season 4 is a live episode that I live-scaped the whole thing. I had audience members doing Foley with me on stage. It was awesome. And so that first movement of that piece is going to be the pilot of season 4, or the premiere of season 4. And then every other movement that's in that theater piece, I'm going to design it as a podcast episode first, just so I can really get the lay of the soundscape land, and then I will build it into the theater piece. And so remaining out of that, there's 2 episodes left, and the last episode, I think, right. One of them is about my grandmother. I've had 3 great losses in my life: Nick, Julie, and my Grammy, Lorena. And there's an episode this season that takes place at I'm really giving away the farm here, that takes place at the Nopaming Sanatorium, which was a psychiatric facility in Minnesota, Duluth, Minnesota, where I had, sort of a ghostly experience with my Grammy. And then the final episode of of season 4 takes place at a motel in Branson, Missouri, the Taney Motel. And that episode's going to be really, really, you can go, the blog is online, you can read the story, but it's a very, very personal look that is comparing the experience of being a queer person in America and what an abandoned building must feel like as an outsider to all the other buildings. And, it's the Deep South, Branson, Missouri. That is the southwestern Missouri, so you're right on the border of Arkansas. And I had a couple public experiences in Branson that were less than delightful. Was called a couple slurs by strangers in public. And I found refuge at this abandoned motel, which is hilarious to me that, I wasn't able to feel safe in a public setting, and so I had to retreat into an abandoned space to find really be able to feel like a joyful experience was had while on this vacation, this very weird vacation. And I'm excited about that episode because I think right now it is very, very easy for people to look at stories about identity and transform them into this phrase identity politics and sort of make them like a 2-dimensional happenstance. And I'm kind of at the point where I'm like, if people aren't getting on mics and telling the deeply true personal stories about themselves that they would typically leave out because of shame or embarrassment, we're not going to get very far. And I do think the pathway to the healing of this country is going to be through the true stories, not sensationalized by the media, not
30-second sound bites.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, what is the story? And I mean, my full-time job, I work for an organization called TMI Project, and we are a storytelling organization that specifically looks at the TMI parts of people's stories, which are those parts that we leave out because of shame or embarrassment. And we help them craft and tell those stories in both live performances and digital media. And actually, just as a shout out to TMI Project's co-founders, Julie Novak, who I was talking about earlier, and her wife, Eva Tenuto, they, along with this writer, Sari Botten, who's also a huge champion of All American Ruins, created a methodology that has changed and impacted thousands of lives at this point, which is really just allowing everyday folks like you and me who maybe don't know how to tell a beginning, middle, and an end of a story in a way that's going to really help people see them. They've created this methodology that has changed lives, and it's kind of like, it's weird because All American Ruins is a side project, but to answer your original question, God, these are long-winded answers. To answer your original question, I'm at this point with All American Ruins where I think this is probably the final season of the podcast, because I can only do this particular modality so much before it gets tired. It's not new subjects every week that I can talk to and sit with and really like engage with and get new stories and new perspectives. It's all me. It's all generated by me, which is why I have guest hosts and producers this season. So I think this will probably be the final season. And from there, All American Ruins is a multimedia travelogue. And so I have 3 short films, a 4th in production, that sit under that umbrella. I have the original blog, and now I have this live theater piece, which is still rooted in audio storytelling. And I'm going to be I'm going to pour all of my energy into making that project a reality, because I have a dream. It was a lofty ambition, but I saw this show on Broadway in 2016 called The Encounter. And it's this guy, Simon McBurney from England, and it was a one-man show. And it was about this journalist who uncovered the story of this missing journalist, and it was like a whole thing, but he was the only person on stage. And on stage with him, there were like 280 microphones.
Wow.
And when you walked into the theater, every single chair in this Broadway theater had headphones on it. And so you wore the headphones for the entire performance. And when you would close your eyes, it felt like you were part of the action. And then there was the suspension of disbelief experience where you would open your eyes and suddenly you weren't in the action anymore, because your brain wasn't, firing synapses between your auditory cortex and your visual whatever cortex. And suddenly you were watching a performance again. It was maybe the coolest piece of art I've ever seen. And it definitely was a huge inspiration for the podcast arm of the All American Ruins project. And after I saw that show, this is, 4 years before All American Ruins was even an idea, I was like, someday I'm going to create something like that and I'm going to bring it to Broadway. And so that is currently this extremely lofty, audacious ambition that I have to really build out this 75-minute audio theater piece and bring it into a Broadway house and loop in a bunch of visuals, because I have so many photographs and so much video of these spaces that I visited, and I would really, really like the opportunity to bring people into that space with me, not just with sound, but really get the opportunity to not have to bend some rules and go exploring abandoned buildings. And that's been the goal the entire time, is giving folks the gift of seeing the joy that I find in these places with me. And if I really want to get ambitious, I have started toying with the idea of a fifth phase of this project, which is a VR experience, so that folks can literally go into the spaces with me and experience what I experience in real time using virtual reality. Which, does anyone out there have $1 million? I will take that $1 million, and I promise, and I will do good with it.
Well, speaking of that, where could people find out more about your work and find out more about you?
You can go to allamericanruins.com. That redirects to my website. So you'll not only be on the All American Ruins website, but if you click in the upper right-hand corner, you can do all the things and learn more about me and the weird shit I get into. But as far as the podcasting is concerned, just like this one, you can find it anywhere. And I'm trying to drive folks to YouTube and Instagram right now, because I've been creating these ASMR videos inside of these abandoned buildings, and I've been trying to see if people dig them. And so you can also find me on YouTube and Instagram at All American Ruins.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Blake, thank you.
Oh, man, thank you. This was a pleasure.
All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.